My name is Wolter. I'm working at MPC in London, and I'm looking after the effects and crowd software development. So everything with explosions, water simulations, to crowd simulation of masses of zombies like in World War Z. I'm basically looking my team after the whole software development aspect of this. Today, it's all about distraction, and I'm gonna show you our Kali distraction toolkit. We built our own system to destroy everything from wooden planks to concrete buildings with this system. And I'm going to show you first our demo reel, so you have 3 more minutes to relax. That shows you all the effects we can do with the Kali system. And then I'm going to delve basically into this distraction toolkit and show you how it works under the hood. And at the end, I'm going to have a look at one production example where we used it on Exodus. And that's going to be my presentation. So let's start with the Kali demo reel. I guess many of you haven't even heard of this software before, and even the name of it is not necessarily well known. Well, it's actually a Hindu goddess of time, change, power, and destruction. And we found this is a really good name for a software package to do destruction. Basically, I think it was in 2011 when we were looking into building the effects for one sequence on Sucker Punch. We needed to create the effect of breaking wood. So you needed to have a material that is like wood. It can bend first, and then it snaps and splinters into pieces. And based on that requirement, we say, hey, with the current system, with the current rigid body workflow we have, we can't actually do this. So we need to look into other technologies. At the same time, a company called Pixelux developed a system based on the finite element method for games. And we thought, whatever we can use in games, we can use in film. And it already looked great in games, but it will look even better in films because we have all the simulation power we can put onto it. So we collaborated with them over the last couple of years, and this basically resulted in earlier this year, that Ben Cole from MPC Vancouver, the brain behind Kali, Eric Parker, the one on the right side, working for Pixellux, and James O'Brien from Berkeley University, the one on the left. They got awarded with the Technical Achievement Award, or the Technical Oscar, so to speak, for this Kali and DMM. That's the name of the software from Pixellux, destruction system, and the research behind it. Basically, the reason for it, that they managed to create a system that can fracture materials realistically, but also can be art directable at any time. And I'm going to show you later how this actually works. So, finite element method, FEM, what is that actually? I'm not going to go into the formulas here, I'm just going to give a rough overview. You all might have seen this on TV or on Wikipedia, on other websites. When in engineering you do simulations like a car crash, it's very expensive to do this with a real car, so you try to do this in the computer. But obviously the car is a very complex object. It has lots of different materials, lots of different components. So the idea was, can we actually find a way to simplify this problem and simulate and solve smaller problems, link them all together, and use that approach. So finite element method or analysis is basically based on the fact that I have a problem that is far too complex, but I can actually simplify it. So we see that here on the bunny on the right side. I have a mesh. It's of a bunny with ears, and it's very complex. But you see there's actually a cut through, and you can look inside, and you see these little pyramids, and these pyramids are called tetraheders. So there are little pyramids made of triangles, and these are the simple finite elements I can easily simulate and ensure I can preserve a certain volume, I can measure the stress on it, I can measure the strain on it, and then I can compute this for all of these little tetraheders, and I can approximate the whole solution for my whole bunny here. So the advantage is basically I can, for each of these little tetraheders, each of these little pyramids, I can apply a different material. So I can make the the ears really floppy, and I can give more of a rigid look and behavior to the skull of the bunny, for instance. So to stay in this context of this bunny, what we do is we have the assets department that might create this model for us, and now we want to simulate it. We want to animate the ears, or we want to destroy the object in case of a building, for instance. So what we actually do is we take this model and we create an approximation of it. That's what we call the cage, the one you see in the middle. And this is just another mesh, another representation of my model, which I can then fill with these little pyramids, these little tetraheders, to create a new mesh, which we call tet mesh, because it's like tetrahedral mesh, but short tet mesh. And then we're going to simulate this one. In this case, we can simulate the bunny here on the right side, or it could be a building or something else. So at this point, we decoupled ourselves completely from the model I got from assets, and that results in some really neat benefits if we are thinking larger scale, if you're thinking pipeline, for instance. So typically, when you're doing destruction work, modeling is creating, let's say, the building. It might even prefacture it, or FX is going to prefacture it, and then FX is going to run a rigid body simulation on it. Once they've done so, they pass it down to lighting. Lighting is rendering it, and sometimes the CG VFX soups and the clients are happy with the first version, but as we know, sometimes it's going to be version 1200 that's going to be the final version. So what's typically going to happen is that there are going to be a lot of feedback loops. So FX might not be happy with the resolution of the mesh because they want to destroy it in a different way, because the center of the object might be at the wrong spot, so their simulation behaves in a wrong way. Then there are obviously feedback coming back from lighting, from the client side, for instance, hey, can you add that one more window or that door? Can you move it somewhere over to the left side? And so it goes back to modeling, modeling moves the door, and then FX obviously needs to re-simulate the whole thing. So you have lots of feedback loops that make this simulation actually pretty expensive. Even if the simulation time might be small, you have at least 3 departments involved, and that can take easily up to a couple of weeks. By using the idea of basically abstracting from my model that I have in assets, and I'm only passing this cage, this approximation to FX, and FX can then do whatever they want with it, I can decouple these 2 departments. So modeling can continue fine-tuning the model, FX can start simulating, and when both departments are happy with the result, modeling can pass down the model, FX can pass down a simulation cache to lighting, and then lighting actually picks up both, processes both, and renders them immediately. And that's basically the way we work, and it involves no longer really these feedback loops I outlined in the slide before. So that was a bit abstract. Let's have a quick look how that would look like if I want to destroy a sphere in a Maya scene. So Kali itself is integrated in Maya, so it's just a very user-friendly, very known way for artists to deal with the geometry. So I can have a Maya geometry here. We just turned it into this tet mesh, these tetrahedral mesh, that's the green guys. And I think we just updated the resolution. And now we're going to have another look at it. We're just going to look at the tet mesh. And because there are tetraheders inside of this mesh, I can actually make this thing explode, and I can have a look at the resolution inside, because I might decide I want to have more resolution inside. Once I'm happy with this, I can actually start the simulation. Now in this example, it's obviously not very complex. It's a very easy, very simple setup where I just let a sphere fall. But that's basically what FX does. Obviously, FX does a lot more, but that's the simulation. Then at the very last stage before rendering, I can actually take this cache and I can take my initial sphere and bring it back into Maya. So you see these half-transparent pyramids, these tetraheders, and you see my sphere that has been chopped or cut into pieces, and interior geometry was created for it. So this is the way for you to bring it back into Maya, have a look at it, play with the smoothness of the interior geometry, and if you're then happy with it, you can go on and render it. The pipeline itself, the workflow, has a lot more knobs and controls to actually add artistic control at any stage. So, as I said earlier, we take the Maya geometry, we compute what we call this cage, this approximation of it, and then we fill it with these tetraheders. Once that is done, you can simulate it like the sphere before, but typically, when you're happy with it, you can just cache it out, pass it on to the next department. But typically, there are far more steps that can be used to create to hook into each step and do whatever you want with it. So these red boxes, they're called events. So we can basically have a pin event that pins something in Maya. We can have a glue event that glues things together, and only if you apply a certain force to it, it breaks. We can apply different material settings also to simulate anything from a rubber material to very brittle material. So let's have a look at these materials, what we can actually do. In this example, that's just a time shot of a little ball that impacts a sheet of metal at a very high speed, and it makes this sheet of metal bend. So this is one material setting where you can say, you material, please bend, but don't break. But we also see at the very bottom right that it leaves a little dent inside. So I have controls over the plasticity. So if something meets or hits the sheet of metal with a very high force, it can actually leave a dent inside, and that material, that object stays like that. I can set up other material properties. I can make it fracture. I can make it bend first, and then it might break into thousands of pieces. In this example, we have a combination of different materials where we have more of a glass material at the very top, then a piece of wood and a more rubber-like material at the bottom, and they all play very nicely together. In this example, we have, well, the torus smashing into a brick wall, and we actually use these little tetraheders, these little pyramids, to model these bricks. So as long as we make sure that the outline of these pyramids is along the edges of the bricks, I can actually model separate bricks and break them into pieces like this. For one movie, for Godzilla, maybe you've seen Godzilla, I think it's 2 years old now. Godzilla was running and smashing into a lot of buildings, fighting against the other aliens. So we needed to do a bit of research for that as well, because we needed to destroy a lot of buildings. In this one, you're seeing a sphere smashing into a piece of concrete, but with a metal structure inside. So you have these blue metal beams inside that actually bend at the time of impact, and then they stay deformed. And if you want to see that on a larger scale, we have an early version here where Godzilla smashed into the building, and then we destroyed the buildings, and you can see the interior, you can see interior beams, and it's hard to tell, but they're actually a workstation inside as well. But obviously, once we go to that scale, I think this building was made up of 5 million of these tetraheders, of which were 1 million roughly simulated, but that still resulted in 5 minutes per frame simulation time. So artists can go in there and tweak it, but obviously one way to be smart about it and to cut down the simulation time is to only spend or only add resolution where you really need it. So in this very basic example, we have a cylinder with a texture on it. So it's black at the bottom, it's white at the top, and white at the top meaning please put more resolution here. And when we pass this into the system, we can actually increase, subdivide the mesh where we need it, and then create far more of these little tetraheders at the top to create more detail when we're going to fracture it. Another way for doing so is we can actually apply volumetric constraints. So you can tell a tetraheder, please don't be bigger than 5 cubic centimeters, for instance. And if it is bigger, then it will subdivide itself. So we get more resolution here in the pink area in the inside of the sphere. So we can have more detailed fracture inside than on the outside. You can also tell the system to please don't put any tetraheders in my object, but just give me a shell. And then you get this kind of a melon effect that collapses on its own weight. I said one thing that is really important is the artistic control over it, and we have events to do that. So here's one example of such an event. If you set up the system with the torus, let the torus fall on the ground plane, it typically shatters into many, many tiny pieces like you can see on the left side. On the right side, however, you see that these pieces stay together. And that's done with an event, with a chunk event, where you can say, you guys, you 100 guys, please stay together, don't break into smaller pieces. And this gives you more weight to the simulation. It looks heavier, it looks more realistic than what you could achieve on the right side. On the left side. Here's another example where we see the interaction with Maya. You see everything that is red is actually driven by Maya, but once it becomes blue, it is driven by the Kali system, and it falls due to gravity and then collides. And talking about these events are actually scripts. So Kali ships with quite a few of these scripts. TDs can use at any time. They can hook into the simulation start. They can hook into every Maya frame or every simulation step, basically, to do at any time whatever they want. So they can even write their own scripts if they need to write a new effect that wasn't there before. So you can always tweak and every bespoke effect you can actually do with the system. This is just one example here where you see the windows exploding and flying out of the building. So the TD here wrote an event that pushed the little shards away from the building once the building started to collapse. And that is basically the event system. Once the TD is happy with it, we come to the step which is called post-simulation. So typically, you might just be happy with your simulation and pass it on to lighting, everything is fine. But you might still have feedback from the CG soup. Oh, I like how everything breaks, but something falls into this area on the right side and I don't really like it. Can you move it over to the left? Instead of resimulating everything and trying to make those pieces behave in the way the CG soup or VFX soup wants, you can actually bring the cache back into Maya as Maya geometry, and then you can either delete it or you keyframe it wherever you want it or add animation to it and write it back out. And this also allows us to, when we bring back the geometry back into Maya and with all the information, we can actually emit particles or emit volumes from wherever things break. So you can add debris effect to it to make your simulation more detailed. Once that's done, I mean, that was not necessarily a required works step in the pipeline, but you can do so. Once that's done, it's the final step before lighting, and that is we take the cache, and we need to somehow now take whatever I'm getting from modeling, and I need to cut or chop it into pieces. And this is what we are doing here. So what we do is we have the cache, we play back the cache, and we know the building, for instance, broke into 3 pieces. And on the very last frame, we know, oh, I have these 3 pieces. Now I rewind. I bring these 3 pieces, or I only have 2 hands. Let's say I have these 2 pieces, and I rewind my simulation, and I move these 2 pieces back onto the first frame. Then I bring in my render geometry, or the geometry for modeling, and put it in the very same spot. And then I can use the information from my cache to cut the geometry, create the interior geometry. Obviously, if you cut an object into 2, you need to create new faces on the inside so to make sure there are no holes in it. Once I've done this, I can write it out. So this is basically, this is this work step in the pipeline. But I can also apply tweaks to it. So I'm going to show you in a second what we can actually do on top of it. One effect, or one artifact rather, we saw very early, and CG soups and VFX soups picked on this one, was this kind of aliasing effect you see at the very bottom. And this is basically due to the fact that we break along these little pyramids. So if I don't have enough of them, obviously you're getting this artifact. So one solution could be increase the number of TEDs, but then your simulation time goes up as well. But what we did is we took the simulation cache, that's the one you can see on the left side, and we implemented a smoothing on top of it. So we identified what the interior is. We made sure that the outer line where it connects to my render geometry for modeling stays as it is, but we can actually smooth it out and we can get rid of this aliasing effect. So now we are seeing it here again on this mortar layer fracturing, and you see it's actually a very smooth result. Obviously, if we can smooth things out, I might want to add detail as well. So what we can do is we can simulate something very low res, like you can see on the left side, which simulates extremely fast. And then at the very last step before I pass it to lighting, I can actually say, well, give it a bit more resolution and add a bit of noise to it. So that's what we did here on the other cubes you see on the right side. So you can add more detail later on without actually resimulating everything in FX. Finally, I want to show you one shot, like a little production example where we used Carr on the movie Exodus. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Exodus from Ridley Scott. All right, there are a few hands, I see. So it was basically about this whole Bible story and the Egypt's chasing the Hebrews. And MPC did quite a few shots on this one, so we were doing a lot of crowd shots on this show. And one shot was actually this one. So there was a mountain and a pass along that mountain, and the Egyptian armies and all the chariots and horses drove along this really narrow footpath and chased the Hebrews. But because of the weight, the whole mountain just collapsed, and all the soldiers, they slided down the mountain. So the main simulation you're seeing here, like the mountain breaking, fracturing, and then the elements sliding down the mountain, was all simulated with the Kali system. Let's have a look at this. So on set, or rather, well, in Spain and Jordan, several mountains were shot, and in the end, they decided to use roughly a shape of a mountain like this, but in the end, when it all came into 3D, we had all the power of combining multiple mountains from multiple environments in Jordan, and I think Fuerteventura it was, to come up with this final landscape, this final environment, where they built in this footpath and made it a bit narrower, made it really steep to add a bit of a dramatic effect to it. And what you can see here with red is what the camera is actually seeing. So it's only this tiny area in this shot. Then obviously FX took this geometry and they started creating the Kali simulation with it. And that's what we're going to see here. So you see, especially on the right side, that cracks develop first and then things start to slide and break into more and more pieces. Obviously, you can't just take the geometry as it is, say in Maya, Kali, create Kali simulation, done. It's a lot more difficult than this. So Kali is very good in giving you a very realistic result, but it's also very good to allow you to artistically drive it. So in this case, for instance, the TD that did this shot used multiple textures, static textures and animated textures. I can see here in the middle on the right side, to create the cut lines where things are supposed to break, but also to define what resolution do I want to have in what areas. Obviously, where you want to break it, you want to give it more resolution. So a texture like the one on the left side was used for that. But if you really artistically want to direct and control how the slide actually starts to behave, and when all the parts of it kick in, another animated texture was created. That's the one on the right, on the middle. So everywhere where you see the gray or white color, the mountain starts to slide. And everywhere where it's black, things stick into place. Then similar to placing little explosives on set, he created another texture that set off a little force along these cracks to start the whole simulation and rip the soil apart at these places. The next step was, well, once the simulation has been done, we need to put a texture on it. So obviously you have UVs on your geometry that comes from acids, but we don't necessarily have UVs on the interior that we need to procedurally generate, because that's a really hard problem. How do I actually find texture coordinates on this interior geometry that blend in nicely with the outside? So what we typically do is we can apply a noise to it, because you might just get away with it, or we use a camera projection to project a texture here from our digital matte painting department onto the geometry to give it this really soil or brittle kind of look. Then FX placed more volumes on top of it, just to have more volumes interacting with the simulation. And obviously, the crowd department also needed to simulate the crowd on top of this. So the crowd department took this Kali cache and simulated all the little crowd agents on top of it. I think initially we started out with something like 300, but because they're so tiny, over time we built up to, I think, 1,800 agents. So these are horses, chariots, soldiers on horses, soldiers on the chariots, with little flags and poles and wheels that break off and collide with the Kali simulation. And in the end, it all came nicely together. Comp added a few more smoke effects to it, or plates. And this is the final shot that we did for this movie. At this point, that's my end of the presentation, and thank you very much.
We maybe have time for one question. If anyone has one question or two questions, not much more. Does anyone?
I see one of them.
Yes. So you have to make it short.
So I was not here for beginning about 5 minutes, I believe. I have a little short question. I am about to make a little video game with driving through sea simulation and snow simulation.
Mm-hmm.
Can I implant the car into the video game?
Yeah, so so the whole technology came from the engineering perspective, and you need to have a lot of computing power for it. But a company a couple of years ago called Pixelux, they actually optimized this approach for games. So it was used in lots of LucasArts titles, actually. Obviously very low res, so you can do real-time fracturing and effects. But we are basically using the same library. We just use it, and we have 60 gigabytes of RAM or whatever. We can just bring it to the next level by adding more detail to it. But yeah, it is coming from games, and you can definitely use it in games. The company is called Pixelux, and the product is called DMM, Digital Molecule Matter.
How long the simulation for the last sequence, the time?
So there were two simulations, actually. You saw that island on the left side and right side, and it was roughly 1 million tetraheders each, and they simulated at roughly 2.5 minutes a frame. So the whole shot was roughly 150 frames, so it was 6 hours, I think, which is still very acceptable for the kind of look you get from it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And Carr is still going to be here this afternoon, so ask